Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So a point that comes up in my mind every now and again when I'm reading original combat accounts, and something that I think sometimes gets perhaps slightly overlooked, is the question of lances used from horseback. And there are many questions and many points around lances used on horseback which I'll address in future videos. But one specific point that I want to make is that the lance, whilst being a very formidable weapon on horseback, is not very good when the movement of the horse stops. At that point it becomes nothing more really than a one-hand held spear, and in fact in some regards it's not as necessarily as effective even as a spear once the horse has stopped moving, or once you're in a melee or moving around, because whilst the spear used in one hand on foot, you can control your movement much more acutely and much more precisely than you can when you're sitting on a horse. And yes, obviously it depends upon your skill at riding as to how well you can move the horse around to control that spear, but one of your hands nevertheless is trying to control that horse, whilst the other hand is trying to use a spear, and you can't really use it very well defensively. You can't really block or parry very effectively, whereas of course when you're fighting on foot you can dodge, you can weave, you can move around much more effectively than you can when you're sat high up on a horse. And equally, usually your left hand has a spear if you're using, a shield if you're using the spear one-handed. And if you don't have a shield, then you'd use the spear two-handed. Obviously when you're sitting on a horse, your other hand, usually your left hand for right-handers, your left hand is holding the reins of the horse and trying to move around. So really, once you get into a melee, or once you stop moving at a reasonable amount of speed, so at least kind of 10 miles an hour, the lance really becomes not a very effective weapon. And of course this is why in many parts of the world where lances were used, including in the British military in the 19th century, the French military, but you know, other places, Cossacks used them, obviously lances have been used throughout history. It was very common for lancers to carry a sword as well. For this very reason. One, of course, because the lance could break or could get stuck in an opponent or could be dropped, so you need a backup weapon. But equally, in a melee, it may well be in your best interests to drop the lance and actually go to the sword in preference of the lance, because once you're in a melee and you're having to parry and move around, or kind of not move around as it were, once you're kind of stuck in less of a mobile position, you're no longer moving at high speed in a squadron anymore, a sword is more likely to be able to protect you and defend the opponent more easily at close range than a lance is. Okay, really a lance has only got the extension of the arm. Anyway, so I was reading through again more Swordsman of the British Empire, which is the sequel to Swordsman of the British Empire by D.A. Kinsley, which I contributed introductions to both of them. And there was an account that kind of highlights this situation, as it were, that lancers are not very effective except when they're moving at some kind of speed. So here we've got an account regarding Captain Archibald Menzies of the 42nd Royal Highlanders, also known as the Black Watch. So it's a Highland regiment of the British Army, and this is at Quatre-Bras in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And he was, it says here, he commanded the Grenadier Company. The Grenadier Company are a company of a regiment which are the picked kind of tallest or biggest men, and they're usually used as, like, you know, they storm positions, and they kind of they lead hand-to-hand encounters, sometimes skirmishing and such like. So they're generally the biggest, hardest guys, and he was an officer of the Grenadier Company. And the 42nd Regiment, the Black Watch, were surprised by a brigade of French lancers before they could form square. Of course, standard procedure against cavalry was to form a defensive square, at least in the British military at that time, and you could protect yourself from cavalry quite well. If you were stuck in line or in skirmish formation, you could get, the cavalry could flank around you, lap around you, and or break you apart into different segments, and of course you'd be more vulnerable then. So they got surprised before they could form square, and every man having to fight for his own hand. The colonel and major being wounded, Captain Menzies was left in command, as he was the remaining highest ranking officer. and while endeavouring to form his Highlanders into square, he was attacked by a company of lancers. And although surrounded, he slew many of them with his claymore being a basket-hilted broadsword, that's what they called it at that time. And at last he fell with 17 lance wounds. Okay, so I'll come back to that point in a minute. So he slew several of them and eventually went down, succumbed to 17 lance wounds from these lancers. Even then, he was able to seize a lancer, pull him off his horse and hold him up as a shield against another lancer, whose lance pierced his own comrade, and he fell dead on top of Captain Menzies. There the two lay until some of his own grenadiers rushed up and brought him within the lines, so he survived. Nevertheless, he recovered and lived for many years on the Menzies estate. His claymore, his basket hilt, is an Andrea Ferrara of very fine temper. Nice detail at the end then. And for Andrea Ferrara, of course, being a famous blade maker in the 18th century, particularly 17th, 18th century, and it was a name that was, this is another topic that I can save for another video, but it was a famous name, possibly a workshop that produced lots of basket hilt swords in the 17th, 18th centuries, and they were very highly prized blades. And it's not really known where they were made. Some people say that they're made in Germany, some in Italy. There is even one source, Thomas Page, that claims that Andrea Ferrara swords were actually made in Scotland. We don't really know, but anyway, that's another interesting topic. So the point really is of this video that he, his grenadier company was attacked by lancers, and they managed to essentially defend themselves such that they could get back to friendly lines. But the point is that he took 17 lance wounds. Now, if someone tilted at full speed and ran a lance through you, probably you wouldn't survive that. Probably you wouldn't survive it happening once or twice or 3 times if you were lucky. The fact that he got 17 lance wounds tells you that all of those wounds were relatively superficial, and the fact that he lived the rest of his natural life, he recovered from his wounds, tells you that those wounds were fairly light and not very serious. And I think this is indicative of the kind of situation that I mentioned at the start of the video, that when lancers get mixed up in a melee, they kind of lose their effectiveness, and the lance essentially loses its power, and really all you've got is a bunch of guys who happen to be sitting on horses. The horses aren't really of any advantage at that point, apart from the fact that they wheel around and maybe they bite and maybe they kick, but they're not of anything like as much advantage as when they're actually moving at speed. And essentially all you've got are people poking with lances. So really lances were feared, they were very awesome weapons to be used when moving at speed, but once you get mixed up in a melee, or once you lose speed, or if you're going uphill or situations like this, the lance really loses its effectiveness, and that's why lancers continued in most parts of the world to carry swords in addition to their lances. Hope that's interesting. See you soon.